It began on a clear night with military precision as guided bombs brought shock and awe to Baghdad. U.S. troops charged up through the desert. And soon, Baghdad was falling. Iraq's oil money was supposed to pay for the war. It didn't work out that way. From now on, the war set its own agenda. An insurgency erupted that became a religious civil war.
Our guest is co-author of the Shock and Awe Theory, a military doctrine based on overwhelming power, dominant battle space awareness, and spectacular displays of force to paralyze an enemy. Naval Academy graduate, veteran of the Vietnam War, simply stated, he's been there, understands how to get the job done. Let's welcome Harlan Ullman into Midpoint today. Also, we're welcoming John Loughlin into the show as well. John, I apologize, I wasn't expecting you until later on in the show, but we'll welcome you in right now. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
All right, Harlan, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Harlan, what is it about shock and awe that made everybody believe that this was the only way we needed to go at that time?
Unfortunately, what you just saw was not shock and awe. It was the 1991 Desert Storm on steroids. It was overwhelming firepower. Shock and awe was entirely different. Shock and awe was meant to affect will and perception. In other words, to get the other guy to do what you wanted or to stop doing what you didn't want. And it could be achieved not only with military force, but with other means. For example, Ed, if I were to give you $100 million, that would be shock and awe, and I could probably get you to do something for that. On the other hand, if I told you I just have the results of a medical exam and you have to do A, B, and C, that also is in shock and awe. And unfortunately, in 2003, the soundbite was used, but not the doctrine itself, because if it had been used, we would have started from what we wanted as an end state in Iraq, not just defeating Saddam's army, and the campaign would not have evolved the way that it did.
So then what did we not do? What did we do incorrectly under the shock and awe doctrine then?
Well, first of all, we went to war for the wrong reasons. I actually opposed going to war because I did not believe that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and I thought Iraq happened to be a good counterweight to Iran, even though the hideous government of Saddam was villainous to a large slice of the Shia population. What we should have done is to work backwards. What exactly do we want? We should never have disbanded the Iraqi army. We should never have come up with this de-Baathification. We had to realize that we had to have in place a means of governing once Saddam was going to go. The military campaign was the relatively easy part of the job, and I don't want to demean that because we had about 150 Americans killed. But the issue was, what comes next? How do you get the Iraqi people, Sunni and Shia, on our side? We completely ignored that, and as a result, we are paying the price, as is the region and as are Iraqis.
John, let me get this to you because you also were in the military. 26 years you served your country as an Army Lieutenant Colonel here, a former Rhode Island State Senator. Again, you're somebody else who knows exactly what goes on the battlefield here. When we look at this whole shock and awe concept, do you agree that it simply was at that time? Maybe some people thought, gee, it might be the right idea, but as we look back now, it was a bad call.
You know, unfortunately, I wasn't in the position to make that policy determination. I was activated. I've served a tour in Iraq. And, you know, you can argue whether or not we should have been there. I think what we've done in the aftermath, though, is create an even bigger problem than we attempted to solve by invading Iraq.
Is it that we need to look back because there are some people who say that if we had only thought this through, and we realize the damage that we would have left behind, that's the big key. Not necessarily what we did. Certainly, it was a terrible thing, killed a lot of people, but we needed to consider what we were doing to the people on the ground and how that would change their perception of us.
Well, I think, though, the key issue here, though, is, and my tour in Iraq was among the very last in leaving in December of 2011. And I can tell you that that had we been able to leave a stabilization force of 15,000 or so in Iraq, as was the plan at al-Assad or stationed in Baghdad, that ISIS would never dare cross the U.S. military, not with a quick reaction force and not with our ability to keep an eye on the Iraqi politicians, which is one of the key places that we dropped the ball over there. We created this vacuum, and then we abruptly pulled out, and into that vacuum flew corruption and flew everything else that caused the government to basically collapse.
I only have about 30 seconds, and we'll take a break, come back and talk more, Harlan, but do you think that a shock and awe would work against ISIS?
Absolutely. You know, during World War II, the Japanese were suicidal. And I'm not suggesting using nuclear weapons, but the Japanese were determined to die in the struggle against the United States. We were firebombing Tokyo and Haruna. We were killing more people in a night than we killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the Japanese could not understand one airplane, one bomb, no city. That affected their perception. That affected their will. Now, I'm not suggesting we use that same technique, but I am suggesting we need to affect the will and perception of the Islamic State, which requires several things.
Okay,
One,
hold that 1 second. We have to take a break, Harlan. We'll come back. We'll hit all those numbers when we return on Midpoint. Okay, back to work. Returning, the senior advisor at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security, chairman of the Killowen Group, Harlan Ullman. And joining us again, former Rhode Island State Senator, as I said, another proud member of the military. 10 years flying helicopter missions, 26 years serving his country, retired as an Army Lieutenant Colonel, John Loughlin. Gentlemen, again, I thank you both for joining us. Harlan, before we took a break, you mentioned that there were specific reasons why you think shock and awe would work against ISIS. Please go ahead.
Absolutely. And in fact, in my new book just out called A Handful of Bullets, How the Murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand Still Menaces the Peace, in the conclusions I go into how we would do this. First, we have to deal with the causes and not the symptoms of the Islamic State. This is 50 years of bad government that turns Sunni against Shia. We have to start there. Second, we have to have a counter-narrative that destroys the legitimacy of the Islamic State and destroys their arguments about the perversion of Islam. And third, we need to have some kind of a Sunni ground force that can take over the territory in Iraq once it is reoccupied, because we cannot have Shia going into Sunni-controlled lands. And we also need to get the Gulf Cooperative Council to form more of what I would call a quasi-military alliance to take on the Islamic State. We can do those things, but right now we're going after the symptoms. We're trying to kill our way to victory. That doesn't work. We need to go to the causes first, and we need to use as many allies as we can. And quite frankly, I don't think the administration is acting with sufficient urgency right now to build that coalition into an effective force to do what needs to be done.
All right, John, we have another then side of this as well, because you too spent time in the military and know what things are like on the ground. What do you think about a shock and awe? Would that work against ISIS?
Not a U.S. shock and awe. That could absolutely be the worst thing we could possibly do. One of the key differences between ISIS and any other enemy we've ever faced is that ISIS is a religious organization. They believe they are fulfilling a prophecy. Part of that prophecy is an invasion of the armies of the West. And once you get the other 2.2 billion Muslims around the world starting to see each prophecy that ISIS predicts coming true, your problem grows exponentially. The only way this can be solved is by the Arab states acting, by Egypt, by Jordan, by Saudi Arabia. It cannot be solved with a U.S.-led shock and awe. In fact, that would be the exact worst thing we could possibly do.
All right, now, Harlan, John makes some really good points here because...
I'm not arguing. I agree with that. I'm not arguing with the U.S. taking the lead here. What I'm saying is that shock and awe is about will and perception. That has to be the focus. And regarding the Islamic State, I think we've made a fundamental misreading. The Islamic State is a revolutionary movement driven by political reason that has used the perversion of Islam as its philosophy for
and I would argue just the opposite. I would argue that it's a religious organization. And
just
in fact,
like Lenin,
Jews politics.
Marxism,
They don't even allow their people to become political leaders at all.
No, look,
it's a religious organization.
I think that's part because, let me just clear this because everybody, I want to make sure that everybody can hear everybody. What we're talking about here is a religious organization. We're agreed on that at this point. And some people would say...
No, we are not. I think that's a miscalculation. It is a political organization with political objectives that has covered itself with a religious ideology that is a perversion of Islam. And as long as we think this thing is really dominated by some kind of crazy notion of Allah, we're never going to get to the root causes, which are political. When you take a look at it, you've got a lot of former Sunni officers, former Baathists. Yes, you have a hardcore of people who are extremists. But when you take a look at the bulk of the foreign fighters, so forth, they are there for largely political and other reasons. And if we just focus on this as a rabid religious movement, we're not going to be able to deal with the political causes underwriting it. And it's a fundamental error I think our government is making right now.
So, John, I got about 90 seconds left here. Let me get to you here, if you would, please, in that time. So let's just say we don't use shock and awe. We don't bomb them back into the Stone Age, as some people might say. What then's the answer? Because you still have to defeat that ideology.
I want to revisit, too, the notion that this is not a religious organization, because if, in fact, it were a political organization, an alliance with al-Qaeda would make perfect sense. Yet, al-Qaeda and ISIS are bitterly opposed, and they're bitterly opposed based along religious doctrine. These people believe they are fulfilling a prophecy, and anytime that we don't understand that, The good news is that we have the prophecy. We know what's coming next. And so we can have the ability to intercept that and intercept events that would fulfill that prophecy. But to ignore that and to just treat this as a political organization, I think is a huge miscalculation.
Harlan, wouldn't you say that you do have to at least include the religious side in this because it is part of it?
I argued very strongly, we have to destroy their narrative. But destroying their narrative is not sufficient. When you take a look at who is composing the Islamic State, the bulk of the senior leadership are former Sunni army officers who worked for Saddam and Baathists. That is a large amount of the core. And you do have some people like Baghdadi, who was the leader. He is using this notion of the caliphate as a way of attracting other people. I grant you that. But unless we get to the root cause of this, which is politics, and along the way we've got to destroy the narrative, and I make this argument in this book, A Handful of Bullets, we're never going to get ahead of the game, and killing ourselves, killing our way to victory, as we learned in Vietnam, does not work. I agree this has got to be an Arab-led coalition, and so far we have not really generated enough urgency on the part of that coalition.
We're going to have to stop there. We're out of time. But I'll tell you what, gentlemen, we've opened up a tremendous Pandora's box here. We're going to have you both back and revisit this again because there's a lot of things we haven't discussed. Harlan Ullman, John Loughlin, thank you so much for your comments.
Yep.
Thank you, Ed.
All right, we're going to go tech after the break and what the monster cable companies don't want you to consider.